Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, recording from remote location on vacation. But this week, I watched Encanto from 2021. So, I didn't have a really strong interest in watching this film, but every once in a while, I feel like I need to dip my toes back into the areas of the big names in animation. At this point, there's kind of only two. It's mostly, it's mostly Disney, and then still DreamWorks sort of playing second fiddle. Uh, but anyway, I feel like this requires a little bit of personal history for me to get where I'm coming from. I don't think I've addressed this directly on this show before. Um, I didn't grow up with a lot of Disney films. I did grow up, however, with a lot of the Pixar stuff as it was coming out. Um, Vivid memories of Toy Story and on from there. Um, and my feelings on animation in general as a genre, both American animation, kids animation, Japanese animation, other international animation forms, is long and complex and far too much to delve into in one video, let alone this one. Um, in large part, I have fallen off the wagon as far as, or not fallen off the wagon, but you know what I mean. I have not really been following a lot of the sort of Disney and DreamWorks um, pop, let's say, pop animation in the last 10 years. Every once in a while, I stick my nose back in and check one out and see what's going on. Because I do want to keep up on it, but there's also so many of them, and uh, who knows what's actually good. Um, I don't actually remember the last one that I checked out, but it wasn't Frozen. However, I do remember checking in on Frozen and being kind of underwhelmed. Uh, but I'm always curious what's going on in the space, and especially as people who I knew from Pixar have migrated around and worked with different people, and seeing who's up and coming and who's developing their presence in the animation sphere. And I feel like Encanto got a lot of praise, and I don't think it's entirely undue. However, we've talked about my feelings on Metacritic before, but apparently this has a 91 on Metacritic. I will say I don't know that it deserves a 91. Encanto is the latest in a series of what I would say is sort of Disney trying to get away from what people associate its normal animation production with. Disney is, of course, probably best known for Mickey Mouse and Friends, and then the Disney princesses, and they really have done very little to discourage that reputation, and I still don't think they are doing so to this day. However, I think they do see or have seen over the last 20 years some of the writing on the wall in terms of that only goes so far. You can only tell the same stories so much. You can only steal from Grimm's fairy tales and so on and so forth so many times before you start running out of stories or just have, boring production or whatever else. Um, and I don't want to be needlessly cynical about this either, but there is an aspect of it which is just a very corporate, intentional effort to cater to a more diverse audience. And don't get me wrong, I'm never going to try and discourage any company from doing that. I think that's great. I think more diverse stories are important. I think more diverse voices are incredibly important, and getting more variety into pop culture is really important. However, I worry that some of the critical response that some of these movies receive may be overhyped out of fear. And I'm not going to delve into that too much, but I basically just mean that there's a fear that if you critique um, things that are more obviously targeted towards more diverse audiences or audiences that typically have not been catered to, that if you critique those things, you may be seen as a villain or somebody in a regressive point of view. However, as I've talked about before, I think it's always important to, whether you're reviewing something that is progressive or regressive in the media space, to both, you know, address it where it is in the space and time that it's made, but also to um, address it on its own. If it's not good media, it's just not good media. Or if it is good media, it is good media. Um, you know, horrible people have made amazing art, and amazing people have made horrible art. So that's all I need. I think I need to say about that, basically. Um, in a lot of ways, Encanto is really great. It's a huge divergence from a lot of the typical stories that Disney and even Pixar have typically tried to tell. Um, Even in recent years, Disney has struggled to get away from the sort of typical fantasy narratives, fairy tales, and things like that. There's been some attempts with some varying results. I think if to jump back to Frozen for a minute, Frozen is not that much of a divergence from some, you know, very well-known fairy tales. So my feeling about that when it came out was very much, this isn't that new. It's not that interesting. There are some elements of it that are trying to be interesting, but they don't go very far. And ultimately, it's a kind of shallow twist on Disney's usual formula. Um, Comparatively speaking, whereas a lot of Disney's typical stuff has a lot to do with the hero's journey of some form, the idea of an external factors affecting a hero, needing to go uh, defeat evil or whatever else, the typical hero cycle. Encanto manages to avoid a lot of that. Not completely, and nor should anything be expected to avoid those tropes completely, but it does diverge somewhat. Um, Thematically, I think it's really interesting as far as some of the things it attempts to tackle. Things about families and the relationships within a family, and generational trauma, and um, even it's a little heavy-handed at moments, but things in the more geopolitical sphere, in terms like it almost touches on it and then like very quickly backs away. A lot of the sort of history of upheaval in Latin America, and stuff like that. Um, and I think it makes for a potentially much more interesting narrative. There's a lot more to potentially engage with, and at this point you've probably caught on that I keep saying potentially because ultimately my feeling is that it doesn't really capitalize that well on it. Um, so you have a very diverse cast. It's set in Colombia with a broad range of people in terms of skin tone and their like cultural experience and where they've come from. Um, but it is deeply couched in a Latin American story. Uh, Thematically, it is very much in the vein of magical realism, in a way that's really fascinating and I think is probably largely missed by um, most of the people watching it. But for those familiar with the magical realism fiction genre, it's very much something that evolved out of uh, Latin American writers in the latter half of the 20th century, people like Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Isabel Allende are two of the like really big names who you may have at least run into. Um, and in terms of taking some of that like that genre and something that is so deeply um, Latin American in that way is really interesting to see as translated to screen in whatever form. And that's not just in terms of visuals or in terms of cultural thing. It's a whole bunch of um, narrative things and suspensions of disbelief and certain elements that are treated as real when they are in world not. And these, I could get into a whole discussion about magical realism, but I digress. It's really an interesting thing. Ultimately, that is kind of only used as um, it's used in a very shallow way, unfortunately. Um, Again, a lot of potential here that I really wanted to see more of, um, but uh, doesn't really go that far. Feels like I don't know. It doesn't feel like it was sabotaged um, by production, but it is Disney. And if there's one thing Disney does, and most large production companies do, in fairness, is they sanitize. And they sanitize and they sanitize and they sanitize. And I could fully believe that this had a much deeper, richer, less surface level exploration going on, and that in repeated washings, a lot of the uh, not literal color came out of it. Um, Speaking of which, it is beautiful. Uh, the animation and the colors and styles that are used, these obviously there's a whole bunch of uh, more traditional dress that's used that has these elaborate uh, sewing patterns and things like that. Tons of color. Color is used to tell story elements as well, as far as what characters wear what, whether it's merely a practical aspect of like what this person's wearing tell you about how they act, but also more emotional things about how what they wear changes and these sorts of things. Largely, it is really, really gorgeous, but not all the way through. On more than a few occasions, I noticed some problems in the animations that I just couldn't quite understand, where people in the same, either in the same shot or in a shot reverse shot, would just look dramatically different. And I don't think it was merely it wasn't just, oh, this main character is detailed and this minor character or this no name character is not detailed. It wasn't just like this person has less detail in their model. The animations genuinely looked worse. Like they just had not. I don't know if they don't mocap them or they just didn't do the requisite like tweening cleanup or whatever. But just some of the movement animations looked off. And I hate to say that because so many of the animations look incredible. I have to assume a ton of this was um, either directly done off mocap or uh, like animations based off of recorded mocap that were then worked over substantially. But there's tons and tons of movement. A lot of it looks really good. The flip side of that is that at some points it does too much, where it's just kind of a visual mess. Um, or not a visual mess, but it's just there's too much going on. It's the it's a problem of uh, what's the term? Um, uh, it's the term for when you have too much of a good thing. Whatever of riches, or it's killing me that I can't remember it right now. But the problem used to be back in the early Pixar days, as they were doing the real technological development, is that they were very limited in what they can do. Now, with the software that's available to people, the level of hardware that's available to animation teams, um, I don't want to say they're at fault for just, going crazy, but like it's made it a little too easy to do a little too much and not think about whether it's entirely necessary. Similarly to in the, real cinematic realm, where it used to be you had to have these huge reels of film and these fragile cameras, and you couldn't move them around that much, or if you did, you had to be very careful. You could only move them in certain ways, versus now where it's just like, let's shake the fuck out of this camera to tell you that there's action going on. And unfortunately, this film has some kind of similar problems where, in order to presumably add what they think is a more dynamic aspect to the camera movement, or something like that, or it's cuts all over the place. It is swooping camera movements that are, listen, I'm not against like using unreal camera movements. I think that's incredibly important and one of the strengths of animation. But if you're just moving the camera all around and you're not using it to good effect, if you're not using that movement, even that unreal movement, to tell a good story, or to do anything other than like add visual busyness, that's where I start to take concern with it. Likewise, with some of the animations, when the camera's moving, the characters are moving, so on and so forth. This really kind of runs the gamut throughout the film. I noticed it most aggressively right at the beginning of the film. The very first like 5 minutes of the film actually has some of the roughest work in the entire film, if you ask me. And it is hyper aggressive. It wants you to be hooked, and I think as a result, it's too busy too fast. I felt like I was staring at an oncoming train or something like that. I don't know. My metaphors are not super strong tonight, but I wasn't taking it in. There was too much visually going on screen. Um, and I'm going to use this as a pivot to another thing, which is the music. The music for the first piece of music in the film is also a mess. Um, it's not bad. It's just like it is very fast, and they are trying to dump a ton of exposition on you, and it is just too quick. I don't know. Maybe I'm old. Um, I am old, but uh, I could not process what they clearly wanted me to process. The introductions that were being done. Um, they even make a joke about it in the song that they're going too fast, and I, I wasn't laughing. I was kind of pissed off. It's again the lampshading problem. You can tell me it's a problem, but if you don't fix it, it's still a problem. Um, and so that wasn't the greatest place to start. Wasn't super thrilled with that. That said, the composition was not bad. It makes me wonder about the audience, right? Ultimately, these films are for kids. Um, but as I've said before, I don't think you should ever be able to say, oh, this is a children's film, therefore you're not allowed to critique it as an adult viewer. No, 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 no. Kids are, listen, I don't like kids, but decent kids are pretty smart. You don't make stupid narratives for children. You make decent ones that are a bit simplified to either cut out things that are too complicated to address as children or some such thing. It's you if you can't critique if a children's film doesn't hold up to at least some limited adult critique, it's not a very good children's film. Um, but it does get into questions of timing and attention spans and what kids can process or what they can't process or what you don't want them to process. And that's going to get into sort of a larger critique about the music in general. I think there's a lot of musical potential in the film, but the strongest songs for me are the ones that don't do the Disney thing. There's one sort of in the like about 2/3 through that I think is really good. And it's the one that most people are going to forget because it's quiet. It's not bombastic. It's not trying to do anything crazy. It's almost somber. And I think it is the strongest one in the film. I don't know the name of it offhand. Um, but so many of the others struggle with the like it's a Disney thing. We're moving. We're trying to get things across, but also we're just kind of repeating ourselves. But we're keeping this like this certain tone because we're trying to impart a certain feeling about what's going on with the music. And even there, I feel like it struggles um, because sometimes the music is a little mismatched with the story that's going on. Part of the reason I got around to watching this now and not in 5 years is because the We Don't Talk About Bruno song is all over the internet. It's inescapable. If you are on YouTube, it's probably in the fucking sidebar right now um, because everybody's done a cover of it. And I don't think the song is good. Not only is the song not that good, it's narratively mismatched to the story that's going on. It's fairly repetitive, and it's a huge, well, it's a spoiler-ish. I mean, I feel I feel free to say it here without a spoiler tag because if you know anything about Encanto, you probably know the We Don't Talk About Bruno song, or you've heard part of it, or you've seen it in your sidebar. It's in the title of the track, and it's just bizarre to me that that got the circulation it did. It's not even the best of the songs I don't care for that much. It's one of the weaker songs on the soundtrack. Um, Now I could get into a whole other discussion about the writer and composer. I don't know much about the composer. Apparently, she also did the music for Coco or arranged the music for Coco. But the writer is Lin-Manuel Miranda, who I have my own feelings about. Most of them are positive, but I am not as big a fanboy as some people are. I think he has his strengths and weaknesses as a writer. Um, and the songs are definitely catchy. They're doing that like Disney kid thing of let's make these earworms so the kids will never forget the show and they want all the merch and all these other things. And I don't want to be excessively cynical about this, but it feels like that's a lot of where the music comes from. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm also very happy for some musical diversity. A lot of the rhythms, the instrumentation, all these other things about the music is obviously very different from Disney's typical fare. It is couched in sort of Colombian, Central and South American sound. I mean, that's very reductionist. There's a lot of really specific areas of you know musical composition all over the Central and South America. But I digress again. It's just nice to hear some different sounds come out of Disney, and of course I'm happy to have someone other than uh, some more white people composing the same old music for the same story for the last 70 years. So happy about that, but ultimately kind of cynical about, you know, it feels very clean. It's very Disneyfied. It's been polished so that it can be merchandised. I feel like I'm being very hard on the film, but I feel like I need to be, especially with kids' films, which ultimately inform a lot of uh, children's media does an outrageous amount to inform how kids feel about the world, how they see the world, and that's going to lead me into the story and the narrative and where I feel like that sort of fails as well. Like I was talking about a little bit earlier, like I enjoy some of the difference in narrative convention and genre that's going on here. Um, and the fact that it's about some more meaningful things, a lot more internal struggles than external struggles, but it is so very surface level. And that's ultimately what actually I find kind of upsetting. Um, there's very little for me to spoil about this film, I think. So much of the film is, well, that's a point of its own. I could tell you a couple of plot beats, but there are so few in the film that I really wouldn't spoil all that much, and you probably could guess them all right off the bat. Um, the the presentation of the conflict, the main character, the call to action, the climax, and the resolution all happen in. I mean, once you take the songs out, it's like maybe 30 minutes. Um, and there's only so much development you can do in that amount of time. It feels like the very beginning of a story that doesn't go anywhere and is resolved when the first step is taken, sort of narratively. Um, but I also find that's kind of problematic because of what they're trying to address. One of the major themes is this idea of familial conflict and all of the things that people often do not say, these very real problems that lots and lots of people have with their families, the experiences of not being able to say the things that you need or want to say to other members of your family, to have healthy relationships with those people, to you know point out a problem so that it can be addressed rather than letting it fester for years, decades, generations. Um, and while that's super important, and I love that the narrative is trying to introduce in a reasonably friendly and using this magical realism uh, um, genre to sort of dampen the traumatic feeling of that for kids' absorption. Um, it's so simplistic that I wonder about its actual value or whether I don't want to say it's potentially harmful, but it makes me concerned. When the conflict is resolved by just finally confronting it once and then talking it out and then everything is resolved, that feels very disingenuous from an adult point of view where you have to go, no, 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 no. This is decades and decades of multi-generational trauma that needs to be unpacked. And like, is this a fair critique to make? I don't know, but like, it feels like it sends a bit of the wrong message, or potentially the wrong message, that all it takes is some simple addressing of issues. Um, and I don't feel like they would need to delve that much deeper into things in order to sort of acknowledge the difficulty. There's almost no difficulty that happens in this film. There's almost no conflict. It's a matter of a tension between a couple of characters that is suddenly brought to a head, and with from the the set off to the top of the climax of the conflict to the acceptance and the resolution and the culmination of the film is like 10 minutes. And that's no amount of time necessary to really address any depth. But even then, it ends completely happy. There is no hint that, oh, hey, we as a family still have things to work on. We have to acknowledge our faults. We have to continue to be cognizant of our personal issues and realize that we're going to continue to make mistakes, but that we have an open dialogue now. And now I'm playing therapist, but like, it's hard to watch something like this um, with my own experiences and the experiences I know that so many others have had and say this is satisfying. It's a little insulting in its simplicity. Now, does it still have value to kids in terms of telling them, hey, it's important to talk your problems out and not just let them fester? Maybe, but I don't know that the narrative really um, gives a clear enough description of what's going on. It's very abstracted to the point where I think it would be a struggle for a kid of, age 10 or under or something like that to be able to say, "Oh, I recognize that this is not just one generation of problem, or it's not just one person's problem that they had to apologize for. It's a more complex thing." So it's a toss up. It's a toss up. I don't know. It's in terms of trying to tell a meaningful and unique story, I commend it for its attempt, but I don't think it's very good at doing what it wants to do. I think if it really committed to wanting to tell a story about familial relations and the health thereof, it could have done a lot more um, without that much effort or disruption to the narrative it's telling. Again, as a kids movie, it's very fast paced. The narrative is has to be pretty short because the movie has to be pretty short because kids have short attention spans and tiny bladders because they're gross little balls of. Anyway, never mind. Um, uh, it's it's got its ups and downs. Ultimately, I think even for like Frozen, which I don't think is particularly good, I think Frozen may have a stronger overarching narrative, but is a lot less meaningful and interesting in terms of both its content and consequences, and what it says about the media landscape, the pop media landscape, um, in the current time. So I'm not going to say that Encanto is bad. It's just not doing a lot for me. Um, I would love to encourage that sort of exploration to see more and varied stories, especially from these big media conglomerates that keep getting more and more conglomerated. Um, but I hope that in the effort to diversify the narratives we're getting, we aren't losing the forest for the trees, and we're not just getting narratives that have been cleaned up to the point where they've been so sanitized to be beyond value. I don't know. It's I'm definitely of two minds. Um, I don't think I would necessarily watch it again. The music didn't hook me. The visuals didn't hook me. The visuals are okay. The story is very bleh. And if somebody said, "Hey, is Encanto good?" and it was a yes or no question, I'd say yes. But I'm ultimately kind of unimpressed. I'm gonna I'm going to continue to be curious about what's coming out. I'm going to continue to look at what people like Disney and DreamWorks are making and hoping that they continue to make more interesting things and push the envelope a little and maybe not sanitize all of their work completely and let, genuine creators of stories to tell those with as little interference as possible. But I do worry about a continuing trend in the media landscape for children and for adults that keeps getting um, more and more sanitized and is made more and more careful for the sake of monetization and longevity. Um, the most memorable things that I've ever experienced are not usually the ones that are the most perfect. It's usually the ones that are um, either flawed or require some struggle to fully appreciate, things that push you uh, and push your ideas. Um, those are the things that I think are most valuable in any kind of media or art. And I don't want to see the sort of bedrock of uh, children's entertainment um, be subsumed by corporatization, but I digress again. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I hope that the audio isn't totally terrible. I'm going to do my best to clean this up. Thank you for putting up with it, and I will see you guys next time.